Well, and it goes back to the roots, though, where he says it's us talking. It's us talking and testing the microphone.
Yeah. That's,
testing, 1, 2, 3.
you should be the bottom one.
Nice.
And I should be the top one, but I got real close there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you did. Yeah, that's nice.
Boom.
Cool. Okay, so prior to video and recording activation, we were talking about homeschooling. And so Chris is homeschooling Ren. How old's Ren?
6. She just turned 6.
So
she would have gone into kindergarten.
Yeah, and she was a special guest last week.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot. I forgot to cut that out.
No, that was because it was awesome.
Oh, she wasn't on the camera. Yeah.
Oh, she wasn't?
I don't think so.
Yeah, she popped in with you. Remember, she hugged you.
Sweet.
Oh, dude, it was totally awesome. Yeah, that was.
I forgot because
that was probably the highlight of the show, dude. Let's just be honest. Like we're like, they're like more of Ren. Like, our 3 people that
see
watch.
what this is really about now. Yeah.
The 3 people that watch are like, please more Ren.
Nobody
Okay, so but here's my question: is because homeschooling is probably more abundant now than ever. Is that right? I mean, do you know?
I guess.
Do more people?
Well, again, what time construct are we using? Like in the last 500 years, maybe, but certainly not in the 200,000 years that we've existed as humans.
Yeah, well, probably the last 100 years, right?
Yeah.
Because there would have been a degree. That's a good question. Okay, but anyways, here's my question for you: is how structured do you have it? Like, is there like an actual plan? Like, we're going to start today at 8:00. Or like, how do you go about that?
Well, it's different with Kathleen and I. I mean, I play it by ear every day. So if she seems like she's ready to go, we'll start at 7:45. But if there's some I'm struggling or seems resistant, I'll put it off a little bit. But that rarely works. It doesn't have an effect on. Whereas Kathleen's like, she gets kind of antsy and she wants to do it. She'd probably start at 6:30. Every morning if she could.
And yeah, I get it.
And then there's a curriculum. We buy curricula that are basically like, this is your kindergarten, first grade language arts book.
Okay.
And to do this at this page.
And then does it actually have like lesson plans?
It sure does. I mean, I guess I don't know what a lesson plan is because I've never seen one.
Well, but there's a pace it out
with a lot
too.
Yeah, there's like a suggested rate, but we totally play that by ear. Like,
okay,
history is too much. It's just too much reading, not enough like other forms of stimulation. It's just words on a page with some pictures, and so that's because you're like 3,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, the scribes would write with a tablet.
And what's even the goal? So I don't remember doing like history in kindergarten at all.
That's the coolest. Well, I don't know how well it lines up with like a traditional American curricula. We just sort of looked at the handful of things you could get and what they were going over, and we thought that sounds cool. Like, because I kind of want to do it, right?
Sure.
Like I'm relearning this stuff. It's neat. It keeps me involved.
Well, I mean, that's probably important just from the standpoint of you're expressing interest and excitement.
Yeah, right.
Which helps her stay engaged. Because if you were like, oh my gosh, why are we going over this?
Well, and sometimes it's like that. I mean, it's like that with handwriting, right? Or like addition. I mean, it's like, how am I going to find any kind of... I can't even feign interest in addition, right? Except that because I want to be like, no, actually, you got to look for these cool patterns, and then you don't have to actually think about it anymore.
Right.
That goes like what I do when I do math in my head, Like,
right.
You take the 10 out and just do the 10s, and then add the 1s later.
Now, when you were a kid, did math come easy?
Everything came easy. I mean, that's my whole drive for homeschooling. I was never challenged in public school by anything. I mean, except maybe I couldn't memorize as well as they wanted me to memorize, but I always thought that was a bunch of crap anyway.
Was that sure? Right.
I didn't want
the
to
memorization.
Do it. I just didn't.
Well, and that's a hard sell. Now let's talk about that in a second. The memorization, but now
I was bored,
Did that ever take a turn for you where you were like, oh, school just got real?
Grad school.
Not until grad school, really.
I mean, college was the same way. At least
you are a doctor.
You are
a doctor.
But I mean, it's just a pattern, right? I mean, until I actually figured out that there were things I wanted to learn. So I don't know if it was the structure of school. I just didn't care until I was like, oh wait, so a fish can move into salt water and then back into fresh water, and their bodies change how they regulate the salt balance. I'm like, that's interesting. How the hell does that work? That's when I started learning. All the rest was just going through the motions, right? It's like when you watch a 6-year-old kid on the soccer field. They don't want to score. They're not motivated by winning at that point. They're just like, okay, I guess I kick the ball around, and they're more like, hey, there's another kid, or his shirt's untucked. You know what I mean? They're not in that. And then one day, if you watch them at different ages, something flips, and they're like, I want that ball. I want the glory, or whatever the motivation is. Same thing with learning, I think.
Now, so in Ren's particular case, does she have things that are clearly more interesting to her already?
Video games. Just like me. I mean, no. I mean,
in the subject matter,
she has different aptitudes for different things. And what I've noticed, I mean, more than anything, is there's such a dramatic degree of inherent bias in the curricula. Like the history curricula was obviously written by this, a typical historian that just thinks this book has to be 4,000 pages long to be of any value. So I'm going to include every minute detail possible in it to show the world that I am a master of this subject, not what's going to make it interesting for the kid. You know what I mean? That's the problem with the history lessons is it's just it's a book with words in it and maybe a picture every once in a while that I would read.
Right.
How the hell am I going to translate that to? And then the handwriting book has got these cool illustrations about techniques for drawing that it's like Apple. You look at it and you're like, well, yeah, that's how you write a G. And then there's drawings, just enough like embellishment to like keep you motivated. You know what I mean? They obviously thought about what it's like to be a 6-year-old and what will capture their attention and also get them to do the work in a way that's not just rote. Like, write the letter, write the letter, write the letter, write the letter. I'm done. I just went through the motions. I didn't learn anything. You know what I mean? And then math is like, let's make this as boring and meaningless seeming as possible. Here's a list of 70 addition problems, but on a brown piece of paper. Boring. And so you think, when I'm doing it, I think about, well, no wonder kids are bad at math. The way it's presented to them is terrible. I can almost, there's a direct correlation to me between like, and I don't know because I haven't done the data, just looking at 2 weeks worth of ingesting these different curricula. The way that our kids learn and what we learn and what we're passionate about is probably driven by the way it's presented to you when you learn it in grade school.
Sure.
So how come that's lasted this long? Like, how come what are people doing? When they develop these things, what are they? Well, what's the mission?
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting because why do we kind of accept it? And so this is, gosh, dude, you did 50 episodes on your podcast of the R versus should. R being what we truly are. Okay, in my vernacular, I would say, at our truest thing is our true nature.
Yeah,
what are you what are your interests and what are your passions about versus should, the way you were presenting that is the shoulds of society or the cultural norms, which we've talked about before, like, and maybe it's a situation where just because you were baptized into a church as a kid with your parents, you decide to have your child baptized, but you don't go to church and you don't care at all and so you do these things just automatically. So and I think then obviously we're doing that in school too.
Oh man. Yeah. Like think about math. Like why do we do math? You never go over that. Like wouldn't that be the first, like the theory? Like, how much money do you have? What do you mean? Like, do you want to buy that toy? Okay, well that toy's $10. How much money do you have? Oh, you only have $2. So how much more do you need? Is that a lot? Is that a little? Relatively speaking, isn't 8 a lot more than 2? So you're in a jam. What if you had, why don't I, But yeah, again, it's kind of like last week. I go like, what happened? Like before that, it was like, we're going to go hunting. I really need to get some meat for the village. I'm going to take 1 arrow. And then you go hunting and then like you miss and you lose the arrow and you're like, ugh! And then something clicks. Like, maybe I should have brought 2 arrows.
Right.
Like, how hard is it? And then there's a need, there's a drive, there's a reason behind the whole thing that's when you learn. So when you ask me, like, when did I start learning? I was like, well, I didn't start learning until I needed to, until I had something I needed. Well, I was learning about video games and how to ride bicycles and tricks and, skateboards and how to, like, translate from a frozen two-dimensional picture of somebody in the air on a skateboard to how I would actually do that with my body. You know, that I was learning all that stuff, but to no avail. You know, that wasn't getting me degrees or a paying job. Or so it is the art versus should problem. It's like, to what degree is school about adhering to societal norms? And golly, that's so depressing to think that we've stolen the spirit of learning, right? Because isn't that the most motivating force on earth?
Yeah. Well, gosh, yeah.
Besides
Well, and I find
sex.
it interesting, even from like, so you talked about the rote memorization idea, and so like my aunt, who was the first person in her family to graduate high school, actually. So she did graduate high school, did not go in. And even into her late 80s, I can't remember if she made it to 90 or not. That's horrible. I can't remember that. But anyways, she...
Is this the one whose funeral you went to, like, at the beginning of the book?
Well, that's the beginning. Yes, that is. And she, into her late 80s, could rattle off all the presidents
Oh, yeah.
in order.
Factoids. Yeah, the factoid machine.
And but at the same time, too, there was also kind of like poetry and stuff that they learned bouncing around in their head and were exposed to and memorized, too.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, too. And certainly she was very capable always at her job as a,
Right.
I don't know what she probably would have been called, like a head clerk at a grocery store for years and years and years. It was probably before there was all management departments even.
Yeah, right.
And was, by all accounts of societal norms of like, I get to reach this age and retire and be okay. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? She like checked all those boxes.
Well, yeah, the American dream was realized for her of the 40s, post-depression, like she did as good as a person could do.
Yeah, right. So yeah, she did. Yeah, so she,
especially a woman.
Well,
Jeez,
now
that's a whole different.
Now, part of that though, too. I mean, in fairness, here was that she actually lived with her two sisters, so that set them up for success.
Yeah, that's
you know
cool.
what I mean, in terms of like that house was paid for then by three people.
Yeah, no.
I mean, and probably at a point even more because probably my father and what would have been my one uncle, probably all started out in that house together.
Wow, so like three couples?
No,
or was this after they died? After the husbands died?
They never got married actually. So all single people.
Oh, their
but
uncles.
then it ended up being three.
Would be
Yeah,
like
my
their
brother.
brothers,
Yeah,
not their
my dad
spouses.
and his brother or their brother, all their brothers. But okay, so they all lived together. But anyway, so they did that.
That's so cool.
But even from an individual standpoint, maybe that all helped it beyond. But also then they were willing to do that.
Yeah.
Too.
Well, that's an alternative model. That's like outside the norm of.
Well, was that the norm back then?
Well, right. It's right. So it's interesting to think that maybe there was more variance in what you were allowed to do with respect to norms 100 years ago that was still kind of hanging out then. Now it's much more, or for some period it was much more, a man and a woman must get married and have a white picket fence and 2.2 kids.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think, they would have been prime in that, really. So maybe even, if you think of that as the 50s.
Yeah, that's
right.
right.
Okay.
Think, yeah,
if you think of that as the 50s, they would have been younger.
Post-World War II.
They would have been in their 20s beforehand. But honestly, they could have been, at that time period, married in their teens.
Sure.
And just didn't do that because there's a norm kind of skewed reality that I think we have now that kids shouldn't have sex in their teens, right? And it's just like, well, no, they actually had sex and got married
babies
and had kids in their teens, and that was the norm, right?
Yeah,
and for one, that would have been the norm just because you needed kids to survive,
right.
Especially if you were farming,
yeah,
right? You needed farm hands. Mm-hmm. And then so you started doing that. And then you probably didn't graduate high school then, right? If you had so, but at the same time then there would have been so this is where we went awry, right?
Yeah, what happened?
We focused on the school, which and not to just be like, well, you don't need school. That's not what we're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. But we lost the life skills. You know what I mean?
Right.
That generation typically. So just again, we're painting broad brushes, right? Broad stripes with
but that's
big
anthropology.
brushes.
That's fair.
Is that they knew how to preserve food, And you know what I mean? So whatever they they probably knew how to grow their own food.
Yeah.
They knew how to save the seeds to grow their own food the next year, and they knew how to preserve the food to last as long as possible. You know,
Certainly through the non-growing season.
yeah,
at
or
least,
as
yeah.
best as possible,
Yeah.
right? So, and it's like and it's so easy for that to. I mean, we just don't.
Yeah, one
we just don't
generation
know
is
that.
gone. One generation.
Yeah, it can.
Well, it's
be gone.
interesting to listen to you speak and to think about how more conservative we might be now, and maybe certainly in the 90s, let's say. Maybe not now because we're kind of getting. I mean, there was a pride parade in Bristol, Virginia, last weekend, which blows my mind. So that's progress. But like to think that like your aunts living together as three sisters in a house wasn't really that far outside the norms, because there were leftover alternative norms like multi-generational living and all those things from the 20s, 30s, 40s that were still around. Like I think about my grandmother. I mean, when her husband died when she was like 60, she just became like solo independent party queen. She got a full-time job. She went out with her friends. She got drunk all the time, hung out and just did until she was like in her 80s in South Georgia. So that I always thought, well, that's weird. That doesn't fit the traditional mold of a prim and proper South Georgian housewife. But maybe there was a lot more of that in the 50s and 60s than I can really appreciate because we weren't alive there. And relative to what's going on now, maybe it was actually a little bit more open-minded and a little less conservative.
Well, yeah.
With respect to which norms were acceptable.
So,
and we're just like focusing in more.
Yeah, so it's interesting because you said that would have been kind of in the 60s for her?
60s, 70s, 80s.
So if it started in the 60s, so the one thing, so first of all, I would say I think it's always not the best idea to blame any particular years, time period, or generation, or whatever, right? Okay. So I know there can be a tendency to be like, well, and this is probably coming typically from somebody that maybe was in their 30s or 40s in the 60s. Like, say they're in their 30s to 40s,
yeah,
right?
so they're older than
They were older than the teenagers and 20-year-olds, right, in the 60s that were going out and
free love.
Yeah, free love, make love, not
yeah.
war, kind of thing. And then it's easy to go like, well, that's where we came off.
Oh yeah,
off the
right.
track. Right. It's like
right.
Like that's where everything changed. And it's just like, well,
young people.
Yeah. And it's like, well, okay, those things, like some of the things needed to happen, of course, right? You know what I mean? Of trying to grant more. Well, I mean, let's just face it, because I mean, you could not even still vote as a black person, right? You know what I mean? So we weren't anywhere near where we needed to be.
Yeah.
Like, and that's, I mean, and segregation. I mean, you think of like that thing. I think that woman now, is it Ruby? The first.
Dang it.
And I apologize.
Rosa Parks.
But, Rosa Parks was the bus. But, and anyways, that went to, is like 62 years old now. Right. I mean, this is not long ago. Right. Yeah.
Well, my brother and sister are 60, and they went to the first segregated schools in Valdosta.
Okay. So there you go.
Elementary
Right.
school.
Yeah. Okay. So that has just happened in your brother and sister's lifetime. Okay. So we just like missed out on that. So it's like, okay, there was things that was happening then that were necessary. But at the same time then is that when you have, so they were challenging the current structure authority, right? That's what was happening. We're challenging it, rightfully so.
Yeah, sure. I don't think anybody would argue. Well,
some people would argue.
There's a group of people
but there
that
is
would argue
a group,
that that's wrong.
I do think and hope that is a significant minority, albeit a loud one.
50% of the United States.
I think. I know what you mean, but in a way, it's interesting because
correlated.
If you've even kind of looked like the one, and I'll come up with the book title here before we leave, but they were talking about the extreme side of the white nationalist. The group was so extreme and so white nationalist there was a group of them that were like, whoa, 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 I am not a white nationalist.
Right.
They
You
actually,
guys are so right.
they kind of even opened up and said they're a Western nationalist, which still is not necessarily the answer.
But they weren't as extreme as the
But they were,
extreme,
they could see that it's like, okay, man, you've really fallen off the edge. Now, anytime you're pushing the limits of the edge, I mean, I think that's troublesome, to say the least.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that can go either direction, right? You know what I mean?
Sure.
The extreme sides of any, whether it's religious or political or whatever, or a sports fan, for God's sakes. Like, I mean, because we've talked about that before. The radical sports fan that drives their bus into a group of opposing fans because your team lost has lost.
Yeah, that's not about this.
You've lost the way.
You've done something wrong.
You've lost the way, right? Okay. So what's going on? Okay, but so back to the idea of the 60s and what's going on. So they were challenging authority, which was necessary, and they were challenging the shoulds.
Yeah. Yeah,
Too.
right.
Okay,
What actually should we
simultaneously,
do? Oh,
yeah.
and or like we were talking a couple of weeks or last week, challenging the global value system,
Yes.
like rewriting that.
Yeah.
Like,
Right, because they weren't just challenging the shoulds. They were challenging the value system, right, and everything.
which is inherent in the shoulds and the norms and the laws and all that stuff.
And that's necessary. But at the same time, if that goes to an extreme, whichever way it goes to extreme, and you go from like, okay, so let's just say this was, like authority structure, common, not common sense, but common ways, like the common thing that I mean, this is the way it is. And it's like, well, wait a minute, just because it is this way, it shouldn't be this way, it should be this way. Yeah, you're right. It should be this way.
Right,
We shouldn't
right.
be. But then if you keep going here and
Yeah.
you start getting like, this is structure, there's no structure, nothing matters, nothing's right. And now all of a sudden you're straight down and it's just like, well, you're just as bad. You know what I mean? Because like no structure isn't the answer. And I always tell people now I don't have kids, so this is easy for me to say. but I think I think that anybody with kids can agree with this and know that you're right. If your kid as a 13, 14-year-old starts to challenge your structure and authority, good.
Oh yeah, dang! Are you kidding?
Because
absolutely.
you gave them structure and authority,
Yeah.
and now some of the stuff maybe you weren't consistent on or whatever, or they don't quite understand why you had that structure or authority, but they have to push at it.
Yeah, right.
They have to push at it. But if you have no structure and authority, they don't have anything to push against, and they don't have any direction at all.
Yeah,
And
can
so
you
you-
imagine?
so-
I mean, and that's where you see the problems. Is that scenario where you have the best the only parenting advice I really considered valuing was something I heard from a person I don't really respect very much. She was a former girlfriend of a guy that I played music with, and nobody, she was just annoying and just I don't know, just a hard to like person. And one day she told me, and just like everybody else, when you're getting ready to have a kid, she's gonna magically bestow upon me her parenting wisdom. And so you always roll your eyes when this happens because people don't remember very well. They're a little mean, and they kind of like to rub it in that your life is going to change, kind of thing. Anyway, and she said, the key to parenting is, you got to set boundaries, and the reason is because you are okay with your kid going here, and like maybe they're like, I don't know, like they might have a beer or try weed or something when they're 18. You might be okay with that, and so you're going to draw a boundary that's like right here. You're not going to be like, oh my God, you smoked a cigarette, you're grounded for 6 years. Whatever. You figure out where you're going to put your boundary. And then you figure out how far you assume that your kid's going to push that. And so you might want to back that off a little bit to compensate for that so that they end up pushing it where you were comfortable with it to begin with because they're going to do that, right? And so that's, hitting that target is all you have to do. And you can sort of regulate how far they go. If you're lucky. Now, some kids are going to leap way beyond whatever boundary and they don't care. And I was like, of course, at the time I was angry and like, that doesn't make any sense. But now looking back on it, with everything that they do, I try to say, to paint a picture of like, this is the safety zone, knowing that they're probably going to go up here. And I at least know the area within which they're going to be playing. And they're not going way past. And I think for me, it's all about not drawing those lines super conservatively. Because that's when you lose it.
Yep.
If you tell your kid you got to be home at 7:30 every night and go to sleep before the sun goes down, which is kind of like what my wife had to do in freaking junior high school, that's a recipe for disaster. It's the same as what you said. It's like having no barrier at all, no boundary at all, or no rules at all, by just being stupid. And then on the other side, of course, if you're just so permissive that they can do anything they want.
Well, and I think so, dude. It's interesting though, because right, this is what happens because of like religion, which is loaded with shoulds, right?
Yeah. Oh,
You
yeah. The
should
Bible
not-
is just like all the shoulds, right?
Yeah,
The 10
right.
should commandments.
You should not get married, or you should not have sex before you're married. Okay. Now, so that, first of all, as we
Right.
just talked about, the timetable that changed with our other expectations of shoulds, right? Because it wasn't necessarily that in let's see. So my mom was born in 38. So my grandma was born in 21, maybe.
Mm-hmm. That's about like mine.
Something like
Parents
that.
and
Yep.
grandparents.
And so in 1921, when my grandmother was born, and I don't even, sadly, off the top of my head, I don't even know like how old her mother was, my great grandmother. But so she had my mother when she was 16. I think she was in fact turning 17. I think is what we figured out. So she was born 21, had my mom turn 17 that year. I think that's the way it worked out. But they were married, right? Because that's what you did then.
Yeah, well, that's
okay.
what you did.
And so they didn't finish high school, and that was fine, all with like the time period and vacation.
Sure.
And okay. So, but now there's certainly a stigma if you didn't graduate high school, for sure. And then more so, there's plenty of pressure. And I think and this is where we can't overregulate. We can't overcorrect it. Not overregulate. We can't overcorrect it.
Right.
This is what we do. So it definitely, because I think I've said this before, it's like I very specifically remember a guidance counselor saying to me and a group of people, "Oh no, you do not need to go to." They called it VOTEC,
The vocational wing. Yeah.
Okay, you do not need to go there because you're going to college.
Same. Yeah.
Which is just complete BS, right? You know what I mean? And it's not that guidance counselor's fault. You know what I mean? It's not. I see what they were doing too, but it's like we've lost that way to a degree, and so we overcorrect. So that stringent, the super strict, stringent religious person that is like absolutely no sex till you do it.
Right.
And then they also do this in some cases, and not all, but in some cases are also like, well, no, you cannot use birth control. Right.
Yeah.
So now the kid's in a conundrum, and it's like they don't even get this. So first of all, they're a raging hormone.
Well, yeah, that's the worst part, right? Is that the desire's there.
Yeah,
But
the
they're told they
desire's
can't.
there. 100 years
like-
ago, 50 years ago, well, 80 years ago, whatever it was, it was more common that they would have been having sex and getting married at that age when they were raging hormone.
Yeah, except I don't know about the sex thing. The desire, for sure. My mom always talks about how, when she was 16 years old, she was a child. And all of her friends were children. It wasn't long before they figured all that stuff out. But anyway.
Well, I think that's definitely kind of an individual thing, because you see that.
Yeah.
I mean, you could see that in
Yeah,
where some kids are like, in their mind, they want to have sex.
Right.
I mean,
they would,
as an
and
adult,
will,
you
and-
see them as a kid,
Yeah.
no matter what. As an adult, you see them as a kid, but they are in their mind ready. And then some kids, of course, are just more kids. So it's it
makes
where,
sense
where they
biologically.
develop
There'd
kind of
be a
mentally too.
spectrum. Yeah.
Okay, so it's going to be a spectrum, right, of anything. But it was certainly less of a stigma then.
Right.
To have a baby at 16 because you were married and because that's what you did. Okay. Where now it's much more of a stigma to do, like, oh my gosh, And then a kid that's in that strict religious setting, that it's so strict, like you cannot have sex, you cannot use birth control, and then they're raging hormone. They are that person that is advanced, mature physically, like they've advanced quickly, more quickly or whatever.
Early, yeah.
And they want to have sex, and then they're in this conundrum of like, oh my God, I've had sex, I'm a bad person, I can't use birth control because of religion, even though like they let the sex part overrule that, right? So the physical need of sex overrides the don't have sex rule.
Right.
But the mental part of use protection or use birth control, they could still override that. Right? Like that's what's happened. And then the kid gets pregnant, right? Because, and I shouldn't say the kid, the kids get pregnant.
Right.
That's what happens. Okay. Because because they don't because neither of them use birth control, right? Then I mean it's the responsibility of both.
Well, because they don't know what's happening really.
Yeah, and so then we create the problem, and again, all of that partially too has a big part in the just let's tell each other the truth, and not call our body parts. Well, it's like we talked about that one day. The kid was like, "Hey, my uncle licked my cookie," and the teacher was like, "Oh, whatever." And then they find out that the kid was getting sexually molested, and his parents had called his penis a cookie. I mean, which is insane, And it's like, but if we were just open and honest about this stuff, and this is what happens,
Yeah. There's actual consequences of this sort of absurd.
Yeah. And so somewhere along the line, too, it's like the structure of religion, and of course that's been with us probably for a long time, but again, it's just been skewed because it was just more common to get married earlier.
Yeah.
And now we've just pushed it back.
Well, and religion is a big one because, I mean, I think the original intent as far as norms and stuff was more need-based for safety and protection and, predictability of villages. Or whatever, and there was not so much interpretation in weird ways, and I don't know. Maybe I'm totally wrong about that, but it seems like it had a decent intent historically. It's become weird, but I don't know. Maybe it's been weird the whole time.
Well, okay.
Whereas and I guess the same thing is true for norms. Both of those things, maybe they're more alike than not.
Yeah, well, I think you're right on that, on the religious side, because, I mean, a lot of times, like, when it comes to, like, the motivation behind my book, so I've had times in my life when I would have identified myself as a Roman Catholic, so, like, a Christian, common Christian denomination. There's times in my life where I probably, so I don't 100% remember saying this for sure, but there was probably times where I would have said that I'm atheist. Okay, so there's a spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
I covered the spectrum.
Well, yeah, you did.
Yeah, right.
You did the.
Okay, I went from one side to the other. Okay, now, then as I matured, developed, and took steps mentally, emotionally, throughout my life, I then realized that, okay, wait a minute. Where's the truth in this side? Where's the truth in that side?
Yeah,
and then so I found
within
myself where if I encountered a atheist, I might be like, well, it's not quite that simple, just to go, because you're getting into the meaning and the mismeanings of words, right, is the problem. Like, well, what does the word God actually represent? You know what I mean? And what is the actual truth behind the scriptures, right? Okay. And then at the same time, if I would encounter like for using terms idea here, a fundamentalist hardcore religious person, okay, that it is this way and it is not any other way. Okay, well, you're not getting it either.
Well, yeah, those things are both equivalent, right? I mean, it's not about being atheist, and it's not about being a strict fundamentalist Christian at that point. It's about making sure the world knows that. So that's become identity, right? So maybe both of those things are totally okay in a different context where somebody's just like, oh, I'll explain to you why I feel like this and I get it, blah, blah, blah. I don't see how those two things can exist in the same space. But, I mean, generally it stops being about what it's presumably about.
Okay, yeah. So the key to both of those, the reason that like on either side, one is you consciously separating yourself out from others by saying that this religion is correct and all others are wrong.
Right.
So you've created a separation there. But the atheist, although not necessarily, although you could argue that they're just separating themselves out from any religious person, which is separation itself. But
that's what I was saying.
The atheist is missing you're one part of the one big whole,
right.
Which is what actually God truly represents, which actually the Christian, I shouldn't say just Christian, any religious person might be missing also.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at.
They're missing also.
Because they didn't have a choice,
right.
Usually, because they just adopted whatever religion of whatever norms were fed to them in the beginning. And so that's why I think there could be people who have chosen these things, and their path of choice might be, I don't want to say respectable, but at least they thought about it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it was actually, it led, their life journey led them to these things.
Yeah. And I have a lot more appreciation, or I don't know. Can you even really discuss religion with somebody who doesn't even know why they do it?
Yeah.
So that's all.
Yeah. Well, and so and that lays into your whole should things. Like
and
should
it
do this,
and it relates to the schooling thing, because it's like, isn't that? I mean, education is unconscious. You know, we end up either being educated or not being educated, whatever those things even mean. But it's not something that we chose to do.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I guess at some point you do. But do we even, like, I look at my oldest daughter, it's like, is she really choosing? She's making choices along her path, but the majority of the path has been decided for her, right? Like it or not just by me, but by school and family.